Welcome everyone, Costin here with a discussion about Kislev for Total War, Warhammer 3, Immortal Empires, and what hopefully should be changed with the Shadows of Change DLC that's going to be coming out by the end of the summer. I imagine very late summer, so late August, we're likely going to get the Shadows of Change. Hopefully, maybe they do decide to delay it, but we'll see about that. Now, let's talk about Kislev. Kislev is overall one of the worst races in the entire game. The only races that are worse are actually the demonic races. Kislev does have potential in its campaign by doing things that just don't really make sense for Kislev from a lore perspective. So let's talk about that. What the developers want you to do, and this is what Kislev should be doing from a lore perspective, is being the bulwark of the North, holding back the forces of chaos. Now, holding back the forces of chaos is one thing. What Kislev ends up doing in their campaigns is they either have to expand in the North, which is not an ideal situation because you do need territorial economy, or else you'll just be swarmed by enemies, be it the Chaos Dwarves or Archaon over here. So you do need to take a substantial amount of territory to fuel your economy, to recruit units, to get hero capacity, or, far more likely, the smart thing to do as Kislev, regardless of who you're playing as, be it Catherine, Castalton, or Boris Ursus, it is to conquer the Empire, significant portions of the Empire, be it the Ostermark, Midland, Sylvania. And this will give you a ton of resources that you do need. But that just really doesn't feel appropriate at all for the lore, but it is the best plan you have on the campaign. Now, the reason behind that is the way Kislev works with regards to resources, trade resources. See, here's the thing about Kislev. Any kind of resource that you find on the campaign map will give you an overall faction-wide economic benefit. So you can talk about income from farms, or you can talk about income from the market square chain going all the way to the caravans. Furthermore, the caravan chain, if we look at tier 5, it does produce a lot of tradable resources. So you do want those resources. So places like the Ostermark, Midland, Talabeclan, Sylvania are ideal for Kislev because of that. But as I said, it just doesn't fit within the context of the lore. So that's one of the problems, that what Kislev is doing, as opposed to what they should be doing during the course of their campaign, just doesn't fit in at all. Now, part of the problem is the poor terrain that exists in Kislev right now. It's essentially, in a lot of ways, the same terrain that we had in Warhammer 2, adapted, of course, for a bunch of different factions of Kislev. But ultimately, the territory that we have hasn't necessarily been changed significantly enough from Warhammer 2, specifically Mortal Empires, into Immortal Empires. You just got it a lot more crowded with Castalton, Prague, Catherine. That is one of the biggest issues, and one of the things that really hampers Kislev in terms of its campaign progress. That's the biggest issue by far, I would argue, with regards to their problems on the campaign side of things. Now, for Catherine herself, the situation is worse than it is for either Castalton or Boris Ursus. What makes Catherine so bad is that while Boris Ursus and Castalton do start with patriarchs, you don't have one. In fact, you don't even have a hero. Yes, you can use the load save hero to get, for instance, a Frost Maiden, a Tempest Frost Maiden, which will give you a significant amount of power. That does work, but even so, as Catherine, you will not be able to get the Patriarch for quite a while, because all of the settlements that you're going to be taking initially, including Kislev City itself, are all tier 1 settlements. So it's going to take you a good amount of turns until you can get to tier 2, until you can build a church, an Orthodox shrine, into an Orthodoxy chapel. So Catherine is especially vulnerable, but both Catherine and Castalton are quite bad. Boris Ursus is significantly more powerful, and that creates a significant imbalance between these legendary lords. Now, Boris Ursus in Realms of Chaos is the worst legendary lord because of his starting position and the situation he has to deal with in campaign. Because in a Kislev campaign, you want to take the big cities, you start far away, whereas in Immortal Empires, that's exactly the opposite. You can confederate quite easily with the other Kislev factions, especially Prague, so you can gain Prague, and then you can eventually play the diplomacy game with Confederation to be able to confederate both Castalton and Catherine. Whereas if you're playing as Catherine or Castalton, you can't. This is something else that really needs to be changed, the way the confederation works between Catherine and Castalton. Because in order to confederate as either Catherine or Castalton with the other, you need to reach loyalist supremacy. That's 600 supporters. To be quite blunt, it will basically take you an entire campaign to achieve that kind of level of a result. And the problem with that is, beyond not being able to confederate with other legendary lord who controls the major city, as opposed to Boris Ursus who can gain control of all of Kislev by, let's say, turn 30, 40, you're going to be looking at turn 60, 70 to be able to gain control over all of the Kislev major cities if you're playing Catherine and Castalton. So there's a major imbalance with respect to that. But on top of that, the issue is that the short campaign victory benefit is actually quite useful for hero capacity, and the long campaign victory condition is pretty good. The problem is, you're quite likely to achieve the long campaign victory condition requirements before you even achieve the short campaign victory condition, even if you're pushing for supporters. Like, if you're playing a campaign very well on a high difficulty, you may be able to achieve all the other conditions with exception of getting these supporters. So what I think with regards to the supporter system, one, it's not a great system, but I think the victory conditions just don't make sense. I think it would make far more sense for you to have a much lower threshold of supporters for a short campaign victory. Let's say something like 200, that would make sense, that would be reasonable to be able to gain short campaign victory condition, and for a long campaign, those 600, if you want to go down that particular path. Or even not 600, honestly, like let's say 400, because even 400 is still a pretty tall order, and besides, you'd still have to defeat Archeon getting 70 territory, so it's not like you'd gain this benefit without having to work for it, but at least you wouldn't encounter that situation where you accomplish every other objective, but you're just waiting for supporters to be generated. Now, the problem with the supporter system is as follows. See, to gain supporters, the best way to do it, like you have the invocations of the gods. But effectively, to maximize your supporter output, you need to do two things. One, you need to basically always have Urson invoked, especially when you're taking territory. For instance, I didn't invoke him before taking over Zavastra over here. That is a mistake, but this is not really a campaign. But on top of that, not only do you want to have Urson invoked, you also want to build as many Orthodoxy shrines as possible, because those do generate supporters. Only one at tier 1, 2 at tier 3. By the way, beyond the extra one supporter, there is no benefit, no real reason why you'd ever want to go with an Orthodoxy church as opposed to just a chapel, because the hero capacity only increases at tier 2, not tier 3. The Orthodoxy church is a waste of resources. A major waste of resources, actually. Now, furthermore, the problem with all of this is that in order to gain supporters, one, you're basically forced to go down one particular path with one god. In fact, all of the gods are kind of pointless in a lot of ways. Like Urson, you only go for Urson because you want to get those supporters, but really, for the most part, if supporters weren't an issue, you'd go for Dash. The reason you go for Dash is because of that major economic benefit that you can get. Also, if you upgrade the invocation of Dash, which you can do for research, is a really powerful ability because it gives you the ability of summoning a bear in a battle for each and every single army. So having Dash invoked is the far smarter choice if you didn't need to rush for supporters. Furthermore, the supporters give you a benefit with diplomatic relations, leadership quite crucially. That 5 leadership, 6 leadership, going all the way to 9 is actually quite important. The control is quite important. And this is a permanent benefit. You don't necessarily need to win the first tier, though it is ideal if you get this as quickly as possible. By the way, Castalton or Catherine cheat, more or less. Especially Castalton, he cheats. Like, it feels like the AI just gets all of the gods' benefit, like all the supporter benefits, especially if you're playing on Legendary. So, yeah, the AI is blatantly cheating, which pushes you to do a lot of stupid decisions that you wouldn't do otherwise. And on top of that, the major problem with all of this, and the major fundamental issue with Kislev with regards to invocations, is devotion. So devotion isn't just used to invoke the gods, it's not just used to build chapels, it's used to build a lot of different things. All the special structures in Kislevite cities, which you do want. So for instance, you want to get the Book of Palace, you want to get the Grand Citadel, you want to get the Temple of Urson ideally because of the growth in bundles. Like essentially you want to get all of them, or many of them, with like a couple exceptions, like Imperial Embassy is not really too important for you. But many of these structures, if not the vast majority of these structures, are well worth it. Like the Citadel of Prague is well worth it. The Bleakness is worth it. The Magnus Gardens, they're all worth it. And these cost a significant amount of devotion. The problem with devotion is that while you won't have issues with devotion as long as you fight chaos, you can't gain devotion from fighting other races. So you can get devotion from demons, from warriors of chaos, from chaos dwarves, and from Norska, but you can't gain devotion, for instance, from fighting Skaven. Which is a major issue considering how big of a problem Fraud Unclean is in all the Kislev factions. And also, you know, things like Draika, Azag, Vlad don't give you devotion. I think it would be a far better system with devotion. And one of the things I hope they do change with respect to that you should gain devotion from fighting forces of evil. Like, maybe not getting devotion from fighting the Empire, but fighting Vlad, fighting Azag, like fighting Greenskins, fighting the vampires, fighting the Skaven should all give you devotion. It doesn't make sense that it doesn't. Fighting the Empire, fighting the forces of order, okay, that shouldn't give you devotion. That would help things out. But it still wouldn't change your game plan, really, because you ultimately need an economy to support having large armies. So you have this situation where you need to fight the forces of chaos in order to gain devotion for your invocations, for your churches, for all those special structures, but at the same time, you need the territory of your empire to have any kind of economy to speak of. Speaking about the economy, the territory of Kislev, what makes it so terrible is like these are all minor settlements. As we see over here, we want to get tier 4 settlements. We want provincial capitals to get all those major trade resources. Now, the issue is that since these all are only minor settlements, they're not worth it. Some people will make the argument, oh, you can increase your Ataman capacity by capturing this territory. That is valuable to a small extent, sure, but it's not really worth investing anything in the territory. Even if you do control it, like you'll gain a lot more if you take this territory and sell it to other factions and building your empire within the actual empire. Now, on top of that, while Kislev can trade, their economy is pretty pathetic when you're looking at it. They do have two structures that do generate money, so you do have the farm estate and you do have the trade quorum all the way to caravans, but the cost of a market square is 1,000. The cost of a farmstead is 500 for 50 income. This is some of the worst cost benefit ratio of any race, any faction in the entire game. Like, some other factions have it just as bad, if not worse, like the demons, because they can't trade unless you're Slaanesh, but it's still a really bad situation because it would take, for instance, for a single farmstead, it would take 10 turns for you to you would need to wait 10 turns for it to pay for itself. Whereas someone like the Greenskins, like, you want to understand a difference in economy. The Greenskins literally pay it in 1 or 2 turns, the cost of building the economic structure. So you constantly have issues with money if you're playing a Kislev campaign. And the cost of these buildings as we go up, like the tier 5 one costs 4,000 for 300 income. Yes, the tradable resource is well worth it, but outside of that, like, you're looking at these costs of 1,000 for 100 income, 1,500 for 150. You're looking at waiting 10 turns for these structures to pay for themselves, unless you, of course, get a bunch of benefits that do improve your markets, do improve your farms, but even then you're looking at an enormous number of turns before these structures start paying for themselves. The only reason Kislev can keep going their campaign is if you fight a lot of factions and rely on post-battle loot. Kislev does have the advantage that they can gain quite a lot of money from post-battle loot, from sacking settlements, so at least that's working in their favor, but their baseline economy is just plainly awful. So You look at the greenskins. I emphasize the greenskin aspect. What makes the greenskins so powerful is not only do they get a ridiculous amount of post-battle and income from sacking settlements, but also their baseline economy is quite good and cheap. The structures for the economy are quite cheap, as opposed to Kislev. Kislev is a lot weaker early on. They don't get the same amount of post-battle loot as the greenskins. Their economy costs a lot more to set up. If you build a massive empire and you have a lot of trading partners, it will eventually work, but there's a lot of effort. And in this game, the early game is especially important. So what Kislev needs is cheaper structures, especially on a lower tier, more economic benefits, more reasons to stay in Kislev, more reasons to fight the forces of chaos, and not have this bad dynamic between devotion and income, because ultimately you do want to build your economy. That's far more important than building up your devotion, playing with those invocations. And by the way, all of this leads, like the Confederation issue, the economic issue, the invocation issue, the supporter issue, what this leads is, as I stated, a major imbalance between the legendary lords. Castalton, he starts with a tier 2 settlement. He starts with a patriarch. He starts with a better army than Catherine. He's far better than Catherine, but he still is limited in confederations. And he also has good relations with Prague, so it's much easier for him to gain control over like most of Kislev than Catherine is, who, by the way, she should be in charge. But then you look at Boris Ursus. What makes Boris Ursus so incredibly powerful, not only does he have the best starting army, but because he's not limited. He doesn't care about the supporters. Yes, he can gain a temporary benefit as long as both Castalton and Catherine still exist as factions. Like if you confederate one of them or one of them is wiped out, you lose the ability to throw out supporters one way or another. You still gain supporters if you're playing as Boris Ursus, but ultimately the problem here is, like, Boris Ursus can confederate all of them. He doesn't have to give a shit about the supporters in any way, shape, or form, like, besides those temporary benefits. So it's a nice benefit as opposed to something that's mandatory in your campaign. To succeed in that campaign, you need to get supporters to win your campaign. His victory conditions are far easier. And furthermore, to even go further on this issue, he can take over Wasteland as suitable climate. So he can take Hellpit, but more importantly, he can take over the entire Darklands. You know all the effort Creative Assembly put into making the Darklands a much better territory on the map, and certainly one of the best parts of the map at the moment. Boris Ursus can take advantage of that to build a massive empire over here and also take over this territory. So Boris Ursus has more choices in his campaign, has a much better campaign plan, is far more powerful. Now, balance issues between legendary lords and races have always existed in the game, and this still is the case, but the difference is night and day. Like, if you're playing a Kislev campaign right now, you basically want to play Boris Ursus because he will achieve far more, far easier, with far less effort, and with a lot less annoying mechanics to deal with. He also has a better skill line, better faction effects, everything that you want in a legendary lord, and he literally starts with no territory. Think on that. That is pretty crazy. It is different in Realms of Chaos because he doesn't have easy access to Kislev, and he won't be able to as easily confederate them in Realms of Chaos. But honestly, screw Realms of Chaos. It's a crap campaign in every respect. But in Immortal Empires, he is far and above. And also, by the way, his own army doesn't take attrition in the Chaos Wastes, and he has a benefit in terms of colonizing Chaos Wastes. So it's not uninhabitable, it's unpleasant, and he gets a devotion benefit for each territory he holds in the Chaos Wastes. So it's like, yeah, play Boris Ursus if you're playing Kislev campaign. That needs to change. Even with a new addition of a legendary lord, that needs to change. There should be reasons you would want to play Catherine Castalton, not just Boris Ursus or whichever new legendary lord that Creative Assembly is going to implement. Now, on top of this, on top of that problem, and on top of all of these issues, let's talk about the army roster. The army roster leaves quite a bit to be desired, because there's quite a few units that are just a waste, or they're difficult to acquire. So, let's consider the situation. At tier 1 from Barracks, all you get are Kossars with spears. Oh yay, they're great anti-large, except Kossars don't stand a chance in melee against any real cavalry unit. Problem with Kossars is they're so low armored that they'll take significant casualties. This hurts Catherine the most because she doesn't start with the Patriarch, but it does hurt all of them. Now, Kislev does have some heavily armored units, but like those come at like tier 2, tier 3. That's when things get better, but even then you have to still account for the economic cost that Kislev is paying. But these Cossars or Spears are not really that important. You can rely on just regular Cossars. So the barracks chain at tier 1 is worthless. At tier 2, different discussion. The entire cavalry chain is worthless because dervishes, horse archers, and wing lancers, well, horse archers and wing lancers are decent enough units, but there are far better units available that you can get in a campaign. From a cavalry perspective or a skirmisher role, like, yes, you do need tier 3 for a toolmaker, but light war sleds are far better to have than horse archers because they're more durable, they're significantly better in melee. They can win a lot of melee fights. You can throw these guys through the gates of a settlement and they will likely win. So there's never any reason to recruit horse archers or dervishes. So you have 3 units at the very least here. They're completely worthless. And Kislev is all about like, oh, we want hybrid units. But in reality, the best units that Kislev actually does have are more dedicated units. Like Kislev, like if you're playing Kislev campaign, what you really want to get are Tsar Guard, Bear Riders, maybe Snow Leopards if you want to play that glass cannon playstyle. So they do have some good units, but they also have a lot of crappy ones. Now, another problem that comes with this unit roster is like, well, Ice Guards, they're a good support unit, but not the frontline infantry unit. Like, you can't just make an army of Ice Guards. Even with Katrin, it's really not worth it. It's better to have a more diverse army as Kislev, like Tsar Guard, Ice Guard, Streltsy, to make that work. That isn't necessarily too big of an issue, but like I'm disappointed by Ice Guard. Like, they're tier 4, tier 5 units, and they're just not really worth recruiting en masse in any army, in fact, or ever even. Like, you could play entire campaigns without Ice Guards. Elemental Bears, not really important. Snow Leopards, glass cannons can do a lot of damage. Some people have really made entire armies of Snow Leopards work, but they're very vulnerable. They're very easy to kill. War Bear Riders, good units. So there's a combination of, like, some really good units in Kislev roster, and some really bad ones. The problem from the perspective of playing campaign is this. Siege. We know there's a lot of sieges to deal with in any campaign in Warhammer 3 Immortal Empires, and Kislev siege tactics are just bad. They don't have the pure infantry power to just break through the gates and win unless you have entire stacks of Tsar Guard or Armored Cossars to do so. And even then, Armored Cossars, while they're heavily armored and will hold the line pretty well, they just don't have the power, the damage, the firepower to win so. Tsar Guard might be able to do so, but they'll take a significant amount of damage. And furthermore, the only artillery unit that Kislev has is a tier 4 unit, which is a problem because of the cost this building requires you to pay in the first place, the cost of this unit, and little Groms are only really effective in sieges. They're pretty damn effective at destroying walls, and if they do hit in a field battle, you will feel it, but they do struggle to actually get those shots in. So what I would say Kislev needs, like some kind of rebalancing of the unit roster, I would argue is important. Some new units, some more choices, especially on a lower tier, cheaper ones at that. Gunpowder units improved because Streltsy, yeah, they're useful in field battles, but they're useless in sieges, which is a problem. As well as, like, I would strongly argue, like, some tier 2 version of the Toolmaker, or even at tier 3, I'll take it at tier 3, but having some earlier artillery, if it's not a mortar, thank you very much, but having some earlier artillery, I'll take a catapult, like, I'll literally take a rock lobber from the Greenskins for Kislev, because it would give Kislev a lot of possibilities in their campaign and make taking something like Help It or other heavily fortified cities far easier, because it's not a great experience having to engage in sieges as Kislev. If you're playing Boris Ursus, you have such a heavily armored army that you can out-resolve a lot of those things. That's the difference, by the way. If you're playing as Katrin or Kastaltin, you have to fight for every single battle in the early game, whereas if you're playing Boris Ursus, you might just be able to play an entire campaign on Legendary very hard and out-resolve virtually every battle. That's imbalanced to an extreme level, I would argue. Like, it's probably the biggest imbalance between legendary lords within the same race, same faction that you will actually see in the game. So yeah, Kislev needs improvements to supporters, and they need improvements to the unit roster. Like, I would argue firmly that having some easier access to artillery to open breaches in the walls would be very welcome. Another thing to mention, by the way, about the unit roster, Kislev does have one ability called By Our Blood. Now, in skirmishes and multiplayer, I imagine this is really powerful, but in the campaign, this is actually a major downside, because it's something that a lot of units heroes do have. And since a lot of Kislev units are actually quite fragile, what happens when you get this effect kicking in? It will kick in when the unit is already heavily damaged and it's losing. And what this means is, like, the unit won't flee the battlefield automatically, which actually is very useful, because when a unit routes, they take less damage. When they're running away from battle, as opposed to you withdrawing them, they actually take less damage, so they tend to stay alive. It's a problem with undead. This is one of the issues of the Vampire Coast. Like, their units won't rout, they'll just completely get obliterated. Kislev has this issue where their units, and crucially their heroes and lords, can end up getting killed because they're quite vulnerable. I've played so many Kislev campaigns where my Patriarchs just get annihilated. Patriarch's pretty decent in battle, but they don't have the greatest survivability. So you need to be careful. Glass cannon, or really a support unit, if you will. Those are some of the issues that Kislev have, like significant imbalance in their economy, significant imbalances between their units, significant imbalances between their Ledger and Lord skills, faction effects, and so on. And I think, like, Creative Assembly needs to bring that to improve that situation. Now, this is not me advocating that Boris Ursus should be nerfed. It's not like Boris Ursus has a free ride. Like, if you fuck up with him, things will go really, really badly, because you don't have the kind of cushion that Kastaltin or Katrin do have. No, this is an argument that Katrin and Kastaltin need to be improved, massively improved in their campaigns. For Immortal Empires, Realms of Chaos, different discussion, though it's not like Kastaltin has a great campaign in Realms of Chaos. And honestly, screw Realms of Chaos. Don't balance the game based on Realms of Chaos, because no one is playing Realms of Chaos, Creative Assembly. No one cares anymore. Don't do what you've done with the Chaos Dwarves and put all the story content in Realms of Chaos, because no one gives a shit. Really. Like, we'll play it maybe once and we'll tolerate it at best, but it was not a fun experience dealing with that. People want to play Immortal Empires. Realms of Chaos is a complete failure. They should ignore it. Whatever balancing decisions, design decisions, should be based on what happens in Immortal Empires. This is the main game mode. That's what I would personally argue with respect to that. So yeah, supporters, invocations, devotion, economy, unit balance. And also more choices with units. Like, give me a reason to get that cavalry line. Like, genuinely give me a reason. Give me a reason to bother with the Cossar Hut at tier 1, as opposed to just having an anti-large benefit to my Cossars, as opposed to the axes that they're using. Like, that's another problem. Like, Kislev, it's, like, just so narrow. Like, your campaign plan is very limited. Like, you only have so many choices to make, and I would like to have more choices, like in terms of the units, in terms of my campaign plan, because if I'm playing any Kislev campaign at the moment, regardless of who I'm doing, I'm kind of doing the same thing. Maybe some initial changes, but ultimately I end up making the same game plan, unless it's Boris Ursus, which does actually have an extra choice. But if you're playing Katrin and Kastaltin, and even Boris, what you really want to do is take as much as Kislev as possible. If you're playing Katrin and Kastaltin, you accept you won't confederate other for a long time, but you take all of this territory, then you sell it. You make an alliance, you try and make an alliance with Karaka Drak. If you're playing Kastaltin, you try and keep Brotherhood of the Bear alive. If you're playing Katrin, you accept they'll die, but you leave Kastaltin to hold the north. You eliminate Frat, you eliminate Trog, and then what you do is you conquer a lot of the Empire, and this is the best campaign plan. The only difference for Boris Ursus is he could decide instead to conquer the Darklands, if he so desired. That would be far more difficult, but it is certainly doable. That's the thing. Like, if you're playing Katrin and Kastaltin, you always have the same game plan. And this also applies to Boris Ursus in large part. It's just that he has an extra plan, and that's what makes his campaign far better. We need more variety in the way we play the campaigns. We should have more choices in the way we play those campaigns, because it always ends up being a tussle with Archeon with not really a whole lot of choices, and the campaigns just feel very boring and stale as a result of that, because they all end up going in the same way. You're fighting the same enemies, maybe at different points. You're always fighting Azazel, you're always fighting Frat, you're always fighting Trog in these campaigns, and that doesn't change, regardless of who you're playing as, with the exception of Boris, who does have a choice there. That's all I had to say. Costin signing out. Don't forget to subscribe, like, and enable notifications, and stay tuned for more.